When researchers dive to the Titanic, they hope to find new artifacts that shed light on the events of that fateful night. Among the many finds, there are occasionally items that make you ponder. One such item is a mysterious camera, presumably found among the wreckage. The discovery raised questions about whether the film inside could have been preserved after so many years. The depth, pressure, and lack of oxygen could theoretically slow down the decomposition process. What could be seen on this film? The last moments of life aboard the legendary liner. People, smiles, luxurious interiors, the deck, and perhaps even the iceberg itself. What secrets could have been preserved in these photographs? Let's try to figure it out. The first photograph. The last day on board. Imagine the morning before the disaster. None of the passengers could have imagined that this day would be the last of their lives. Some were enjoying breakfast in an exquisite restaurant. Some were stepping out onto the deck, breathing in the fresh ocean air. And some, perhaps, were simply photographing moments that would forever remain in history. There were several amateur photographers on board the Titanic, and many passengers might have had their own cameras. Among the personal belongings found later, there were photographs taken just a few hours before the tragedy. In them, smiling faces of children playing on the deck, ladies in elegant outfits, men conversing in the lounge area. These people did not know that soon the ocean would become their final resting place. But if the found camera really belonged to someone from the Titanic, could it have preserved even more unique shots on its film? Perhaps among them is the last photo taken on board at that moment, before the world of his ship ended in the icy darkness. The photo with the iceberg is the main evidence. Almost everyone knows that the Titanic collided with an iceberg, but few have seen its true appearance. However, there are several photos of icebergs taken in the area of the wreck during those days. One of them is particularly interesting. It shows a dark stripe, which may be the trace of the collision with the giant liner. If among the potential finds there really was a camera taken from the Titanic, the question arises, could its owner have managed to capture the fateful encounter with the icy mass? In the history of shipping, there are rare cases when such footage appeared decades after the disaster. For example, photos of the Lusitania before it was torpedoed or footage of the burning airship, Hindenburg. But was there anything similar from the Titanic? So far, officially confirmed footage of the iceberg remains a subject of debate. But if a photo ever emerges taken from aboard the liner, it could become the main evidence of this tragedy. How could the camera end up at the bottom? When the Titanic collided with the iceberg and began to sink, chaos erupted on board. People were trying to save themselves, grabbing the essentials, and some, realizing their chances were slim, tried to leave a memory of themselves. If the camera was indeed found among the wreckage, how could it have ended up there? One possible scenario. Its owner tried to take it with them, but at the moment of the ship sinking, it either fell out or was left in the cabin. Some passengers, according to eyewitness accounts, were throwing suitcases overboard in the hope that their belongings would float and be found later. It is also known that after the liner sank, many items were floating on the water's surface. Some of them, such as wooden panels and suitcases, were later found by the rescued passengers and crew of the Carpathia. However, most of the items, along with the ship's wreckage, slowly sank into the abyss. It's possible that the camera was inside the luggage or got wedged between the ship's structures, which helped preserve it. This is supported by the fact that even paper documents and leather goods, which managed to survive for centuries underwater, have been found at the wreck site. If researchers had actually stumbled upon such an object, it would have been one of the most significant finds in the history of research. Titanic. But the most important question remains the same. What exactly could have been preserved on its film? Photos of the luxurious interiors. The Titanic was not just a ship, it was a floating palace, a symbol of progress, comfort, and wealth. The luxurious first-class interiors could rival the best hotels in the world. A grand staircase with gilded railings, crystal chandeliers, marble columns, and handmade carpets. All of this disappeared into the depths of the Atlantic. But long before the disaster, many passengers, realizing they were aboard a historic vessel, sought to capture these beauties on film. Some of these photos have been preserved in archives, but if a camera from the Titanic was indeed found, then perhaps its owner captured the ship's interiors with their own eyes. In some photographs recovered from personal belongings of passengers, cabins, restaurants, and promenade decks are visible. However, the question remains open. How many more unknown photos might be stored in the wreckage, waiting for their time? Faces that are no longer with us in photographs are the only things that remain of people who have vanished into history. The faces of Titanic passengers are forever captured in yellowed photographs. But what if there were still unknown shots? Many victims of the disaster remain nameless, and only items found among the wreckage helped identify some of them. Items that told more about them than the official passenger lists. If images were preserved on a hypothetically found camera, then perhaps they are not just pictures of the ship, but the last shots of people who are no longer with us. Imagine a person photographing friends at dinner, smiles, glasses of champagne, and no one yet knows that in a few hours these people will disappear into the icy water. What stories could these pictures tell? Could there be a photograph among them of a person whose fate remains unknown? Classified images and photographs taken on the Titanic and during its sinking have always been of great interest. In official archives, there are many pictures that captured the liner before its passengers and crew departed, as well as some shots of the wreckage taken during the first expeditions. But there are also images that, for various reasons, remain little known or even inaccessible to the general public. For example, it is known that after the sinking of the Titanic, several passengers of the Carpathia, the ship that first came to the rescue, took pictures of what remained on the ocean's surface. These shots could have shown lifeboats, debris, possibly even the bodies of the deceased, but they were almost never published. Why? Perhaps out of respect for the deceased, or maybe because they were too grim. Some photographs of the Titanic taken during the first underwater expeditions in the 1980s were also not shown to the public for a long time. For example, the first images from the wreck site, taken from the submersible Alvin, were initially circulated only among a small group of researchers. The question is whether there are still unpublished photos from recent expeditions. Unusual finds near the camera. When researchers send robots down to the Titanic wreck site, they are looking not only for the ship's debris but also for passengers' personal belongings. For over 100 years, hundreds of items have been preserved on the ocean floor, which once belonged to the people who traveled on this liner. Some finds surprise even the most experienced specialists. For example, leather suitcases were found that, despite the pressure and water, remained almost untouched. Marine flora and fauna. They simply weren't disturbed. In such suitcases, letters, photographs, documents, and personal belongings were found. One of the most famous finds is a wristwatch. It stopped at the moment it submerged in water, but there are also items whose origins are not always clear. For example, among the wreckage, parts of cameras and film reels were found, most of which, of course, were destroyed by water. But the very fact that such items can be preserved makes one think. What if, someday, a completely preserved camera is discovered? With footage from that fateful day, early 20th century cameras were mechanical and did not rely on electricity, and the film could theoretically be preserved if it was in a sealed case. What happened to the camera after it was raised? If we assume that researchers did indeed find a camera among the Titanic wreckage, what could have happened to it next? Artifacts raised from the seabed usually undergo a complex conservation process. Items that have been in seawater for over a century deteriorate upon contact with air, so they need to be stabilized. For example, found paper documents are often kept in a special solution to prevent them from disintegrating. The situation with film is even more complicated. The regular film of those times was made from cellulose nitrate, a material that is very unstable and easily deteriorates. However, in rare cases, it can be preserved in extreme conditions if it was isolated from water. Have there been instances in history where photographic materials were restored after being submerged in water for a long time? Yes. For example, in 2013, film was found in Antarctica that had been lying in the ice for almost 100 years. Some of the images were successfully restored. If a camera from the Titanic did indeed exist and was recovered, then perhaps specialists have already tried to decipher the images. But if that hasn't happened, the question remains whether it will be possible to do so in the future. Other mysterious photos of the Titanic. Since the sinking of the Titanic, it has been photographed thousands of times. Before the disaster, after, during underwater expeditions. Some images have become iconic, but there are also those that raise questions. For example, there is a well-known photograph taken from the ship Prince Albert the morning after the sinking. It shows an iceberg with red marks that could have been painted from the Titanic's hull. This photo is often cited as evidence that this particular iceberg was the cause of the disaster. Another interesting case is a photograph from the Carpathia. After rescuing the passengers, some photos taken on board showed people in a state of shock. However, some photographs might have contained more details about the disaster, but for some reason were not published. There is also a series of underwater photos taken in 1991, showing individual cabins, tableware, and passengers' personal belongings. These images became a sensation, but what if even rarer photos remain among the wreckage? Mystery on film. When it comes to the Titanic, there are always people who try to find something mysterious in this story. They talk about passengers' premonitions, strange coincidences, and sometimes even inexplicable phenomena related to the ship's wreckage. Some researchers who descended to the crash site reported hearing inexplicable sounds, similar to knocks, coming from the depths. Of course, official science explains this as underwater currents and the movement of metal under pressure. But rumors still spread. And what if a hypothetically found camera captured something strange? Perhaps something that doesn't fit into the usual picture. Sometimes, in old photographs, you can see silhouettes of people who shouldn't be in the picture, or strange shadows creating a creepy atmosphere. In reality, any distorted images can be explained by technical factors. Light transmission, film damage, defects in old lenses. Artifacts found nearby. Research on the Titanic has been ongoing for decades. Each new expedition brings new discoveries. In addition to large parts of the ship, researchers find hundreds of small artifacts left behind by passengers. Some of them have become true symbols of the tragedy. For example, John Astor's gold watch, which stopped at the moment of submersion. A leather suitcase with letters. Thanks to the bag's airtightness, the paper did not decompose, and the passengers' messages could be read. A champagne bottle with an unopened cork, a symbol that the celebration on the Titanic was interrupted forever. If the camera was indeed among the wreckage, what else could be nearby? It is logical to assume that the personal belongings of its owner, possibly notes, letters, and other items, might be there. Moreover, some discoveries remain a mystery. For example, researchers found keys to cabin doors, but no one knows which doors they opened. Or glass bottles containing unknown substances. Who could have taken these pictures? If we imagine that a camera from the Titanic did indeed exist, the question arises as to whom it belonged. Who could have captured the last hours before the disaster? There were several amateur photographers on board the liner, known from the surviving photographs. Francis Brown, an Irish priest, who took a series of photographs of the liner before its departure. Fortunately, he disembarked from the ship before the tragedy. Vernice Palmer, a passenger on the Carpathia, who took the first shots of the rescued passengers. Lewis Middleton, a boy who photographed life on board, but his pictures were never found. If a camera was ever discovered, it could have belonged to one of these people or another unknown passenger. Perhaps there were other people on the Titanic with cameras, whose photos remain lost at the bottom of the ocean. Are there still undiscovered cameras? Over decades of Titanic research, many artifacts have been recovered, but most of the wreckage remains untouched. Scientists believe that hundreds of personal belongings of passengers, including letters, documents, and possibly photographic equipment, may still be on the seabed. It is known that there was a cabin for journalists on the Titanic, which could have contained cameras and film. However, this section sank with the ship, and it is still unknown whether any items remain there. Some researchers suggest that in the future, technology will allow more items to be raised from the seabed and possibly discover new cameras. But the question is whether anything will remain on them after more than a century underwater. Why is the Titanic still being researched? More than a century has passed since the Titanic sank, but the interest in it has not waned. Research missions continue, even though it seems that everything has already been studied. So why do scientists keep returning to the wreckage? The first reason is technological progress. Every decade brings new methods for studying underwater objects. For example, modern 3D scanners allow for the creation of accurate digital models of the ship, which helps analyze the degree of deterioration and predict how long the wreckage will last. The second reason is the search for new artifacts. Despite numerous expeditions, a large part of the Titanic remains unexplored. Third-class cabins, service areas, storerooms, all of this is still hidden from researchers' eyes. It is quite possible that personal belongings of passengers and crew can still be found there. The third reason is respect for history. The Titanic has become a symbol of human ambition and tragedy. Each new discovery helps us to understand more deeply what people experienced on that fateful night and to preserve the memory of this event for future generations. The ship continues to deteriorate, and researchers have less and less time to document its current state. Perhaps soon there will be new expeditions that will reveal to the world new facts about the legendary liner. How has the wreck site changed over 100 years? When researchers first discovered the Titanic wreck in the early 1980s, the ship appeared relatively well preserved. Although the hull was already damaged by time and pressure, many elements, such as staircases, furniture, and tableware, remained in place. But with each passing year, the condition of the liner deteriorates. The main threat is iron bacteria, which destroy metal structures. Scientists have found that microorganisms literally eat away at the steel hull, turning it into rusty growths that eventually crumble. According to experts' forecasts, in a few decades, only piles of rust and scattered artifacts may remain of the Titanic. Besides bacteria, the ocean itself also contributes to the destruction. Strong currents shift the debris, sand gradually covers parts of the ship, and water pressure makes the metals brittle. Researchers note that some sections of the liner, which were recently well distinguishable, are now barely recognizable. That's why new expeditions strive to capture all the details using 3D scanning. This will help preserve a digital copy of the Titanic, even when the ship itself finally disappears into the ocean depths. What secret do these photos reveal? The photographs of the Titanic are not just pictures. They are the last testimony of a world that vanished in the cold waters of the Atlantic. If the camera were ever found, it could show us something we've never seen before. The last moment before the tragedy, faces of passengers who are no longer with us, or perhaps even footage of the collision itself, but even if such images do not exist. The very idea that there might be unsolved mysteries lying somewhere at the bottom of the ocean makes this story even more captivating. Will new photographs of the Titanic ever be found? This is a question, the answer to which may await us in a future video.